The Civil Rights Act of 1964, a case study in the policy process. So we've talked about this now twice. Once, very quickly in the introduction to the course. In this unit, a little more, we'll be going through this part of the process in more depth. The policy process, as you recall, consists of 5 general elements. Now, you'll see people might use some different terms for these things, but this is one fairly common method of looking at the policy process. And obviously, it starts with identification, identifying the problem or a problem to be addressed, formulating a solution, legislating that solution, implementing that solution, and then evaluating, the solution, and then going back. So we'll also see that there's you can break these pieces down again, and we'll see that, for example, formulation, legislation, sometimes those two processes can go hand in hand, as well as, legislation might not end. There might be other ways of doing legislation. So we'll see quite a bit of that. So one of the other things we do when we evaluate a policy is examine its intended and unintended consequences. So, for example, if you passed a policy to, reduce poverty in America, one of the clear tests that you would run is, did the poverty rate in America in fact drop significantly, or to the extent that you had targeted? 2, if it did the policy actually make that happen, or did it happen in spite of the policy, which could happen? So making sure that there has to be a correlation between the two, a strong correlation between the two. And then 3, what were the unintended consequences of the policy? So you passed this law to reduce poverty, and at the same time, an unintended consequence was in fact that one particular group of people actually not only didn't leave poverty, in fact, they got even more impoverished. Or some other seemingly unconnected at first thing, which might mean a number of people dropped investment in new stocks or new businesses or things because the money they were using for said investment had been appropriated in the taxes to support the anti-poverty campaign, or that we are weaker in, say, emergency preparedness because that budget got trimmed to reallocate the money to something else. So you could say that's intended. Some of those are unintended. So you do have to run a rather complete analysis of it. So just something to keep in mind as you look at all policies. And you will hear a lot of this, especially in the, during presidential election years or any election year. So-and-so voted on this policy and it's bad. I've seen a lot of it in class discussions, but the question remains, people often say that. For example, people often say, well, and then so-and-so got elected, or, we could say Obama got elected, or Bush got elected, or Hillary Clinton gets elected, or whoever it is. And all of a sudden those policies are bad. Or a common one saying, well, all of these spending proposals that asked for money for a language program at a university, or money that was allocated for a bridge project, that's all waste. Well, okay, you may feel that, and your emotion is compelling, but it is not convincing. So in other words, before you make that assumption, in fact, if you're running for office and you say that, many people might believe you. And there are people who might agree, well, of course this is a wasteful thing. Well, why? You might say, well, we shouldn't be spending money on this. What's its utility? Well, you ask, but you didn't necessarily get any data on that. So, for example, a number of people might have believed, a Russian language program that was given a government grant in the 1950s or the 40s was a bad idea. And then you realize, oh, well, maybe not, because those Russian language graduates actually help the government read intercepted Russian documents that help provide for the national defense. So you have to, in all policies, be more diligent. And this is a dangerous area we run into in politics, because when we think of things in policy, we think of, when we lack data, a lot of times our analysis of a policy or policy proposal or idea rests upon a world view. We have a simplified worldview or philosophy, and we like to believe works. Everyone does, and we all do this. So, for example, saying, oh, well, you know what? Yes, I think, why are we spending all this money on state universities or colleges? You know what? It should be made for-profit and competitive because the market solves things. Okay? It fits our worldview. We've had no data on this. If we have data, a lot of it is anecdotal. Well, my brother's cousin, or my cousin, or, my cousin's cousin on the other side of the family said this. Meaningful data. And we can all say that statistics lie. No, statisticians lie. Statistics are statistics. So one of the things we have to also be careful of is the quality of our data, its reliability, and our ability to gather multiple sources of information before resorting to a simple worldview rejection of a particular idea because we don't feel we like it because we don't know anything about it. And the reason I preface this, it sounds pretty stern, but I'm not trying to be that stern. But the reason I make this as a preface is because as we talk about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there's a number of people who have a number of opinions on the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And it's often, I think, based on a real lack of data about it. And I think if people had more data or understood more about the process of the policy, how it was made, and how we might analyze it, a few things might come to bear. And one is that they might realize that certain aspects they thought were devilish or fiendish actually aren't really at all like that. And then some things they didn't even know about it might turn out to be, that I think people should probably really be questioning. No one ever questions it because they don't know much about it. And it's a long-term policy. So part of the policy process, part of educating yourself as a citizen is understanding sort of this kind of review of a bill or a policy. And so if we look back to 1964 and what's going on, we can start with the problem. What is the problem? Very simply, in spite of the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments at the end of the Civil War and after the Civil War, the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education and federal desegregation, there are still problems in the United States in 1964. One is that we have the phenomenon known as institutional racism. Does anyone know what institutional racism is? If you take a minute and think about it. It simply means that not all acts of racism are necessarily overt. And by overt, I mean a conscious effort on part of one party to discriminate or segregate another. Sometimes racial segregation or discrimination can be built into processes or codes or policies or ways of doing things that aren't necessarily written down in fact. And it's not necessarily intentional. It could be, and in some cases it's very intentional, but it might not necessarily be mentioned. One example of institutional racism that we can look at that comes out on the government is at that time in the 1960s, the military draft. In 1968, when draft calls were at their highest for the Vietnam War. When you look back statistically, blacks are way overrepresented in comparison to their part of the population. So you have 80% of the draftees going to Vietnam are from poor and working class backgrounds. and I think you have something like 20% representation of draftees are black or minorities, and well, there's maybe a 8% to 12% black population in the United States. Why are so many African Americans being drafted? Well, it turns out that poor schooling, a lack of certain job opportunities, lack of access to universities, and discrimination in admissions processes, these sorts of things, have all meant that any of the deferments used to get yourself out of going to Vietnam that were available to many of whites from more affluent areas and things, were not available to those individuals, and so they're drafted. They're 1A. So, while this is not necessarily an attempt by the government to single out black men at age 18 or 19 and tell them to go to war, it certainly had that effect. And so that would be an example of an institutional racism. But they do exist, and sometimes we see, especially in the age of Facebook, you see the pictures that saying, oh, well, people complain. It's like, this really isn't a complaint. It's a serious systemic problem. And, ignoring it or simply downplaying it because of our worldview without data just would make us ignorant. You also have racism in hiring, which is a real problem in the United States, especially in 1964. Not many things had changed as far as hiring in 1964, and so a lot of young African Americans who are entering the workforce are either unemployed or underemployed, meaning that for their skill set, they do not have jobs commensurate with that skill set, and for a number of African Americans, they can't get jobs. Companies and other places don't necessarily want to hire them. The other thing is that when hired for work, they are all almost exclusively paid, well, not exclusively, but most of them are paid much less than their white coworkers for the same kind of work, as are women in a number of these places. So what we see are serious problems as far as pay, hiring, everything else. We also see minorities underrepresented in schools and in the workforce. So that means in higher education, for example, for a number of factors, you don't have African American populations in schools being commensurate with African American populations in the general public. So in other words, if the United States, 12% of the U.S. population is black, you have nowhere near 12% of college populations being black, which randomly you would sort of assume would be fairly evenly distributed or fairly regular. So those are some serious problems, and it also causes major economic problems in, faced by a number of black families and African Americans. So what does it lead to, and how does this law come about as a means of possible redress? Now, in the first phase of the policy process, sort of identifying a problem, doesn't always mean that everyone agrees that this is or something is a problem. And in this case, not everyone agreed that this was an issue that was in fact a problem. A number of Northern Democrats saw racial discrimination or the lack of opportunity in jobs and other things as a serious problem in America. Most Northern Republicans agreed, and there weren't many Southern Republicans really yet, but there were some Southern Republicans who also maybe agreed, some others not at all. They aligned with Southern Democrats, and the big resistance here were Southern Democrats in this case, because they wanted to resist any attempts at integration, and most wanted to promote continued segregation, even though it was post Brown versus Board of Ed. It's even more of an issue because the president is in a political pickle. What is it? Kennedy, JFK, as we saw, was a very popular president in many respects, but he won the election of 1960 by a razor-thin popular vote, which gave him the votes he needed in the Electoral College to carry victory over Nixon. His party took a hit. The Democratic Party took a hit in the 1962 midterm election. And Kennedy took a hit after a few issues. One was the Bay of Pigs invasion, which had many people questioning him and his resolve against the communists. He did recover some of that after the Cuban Missile Crisis, but others were wanting a more hawkish Kennedy. And some people were concerned about JFK's stance on business, especially during a recession, which he experienced after taking office. And for all of that, Southern Democrats didn't necessarily like Kennedy. The Democratic Party had a problem. And the fact is very simple, is that Southern Democrats and Northern Democrats were still members of one party, but they started to see they had very different political objectives in many cases. And Kennedy was not feeling the love from Southern Democrats. This is a problem for him, especially as he's thinking forward to 1964 and a re-election bid. Why was JFK in Dallas the day he was shot, November 22nd, 1964? I'm sorry, 63. Why was JFK in Dallas in 1963, November 22nd, 1963, is because he was worried about losing the state of Texas in the next election. And this was the home state of his very popular Vice President, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Texans loved voting for LBJ. They did not like voting for Kennedy as such. And he was trying to make an appeal and heal any rifts between him and Southern Democrats. So JFK maybe had wanted to move more forward on civil rights legislation, but while he's feeling the pressure from his northern constituency saying move on civil rights, he has met with Martin Luther King and members of the Southern Christian Leadership Committee saying move on civil rights. At the same time, Kennedy's saying, I cannot move on civil rights until I get reelected, because if I move on civil rights too quickly, I'll lose the Southern Democrats. They'll align with Republicans and elect a Republican who won't necessarily do anything on civil rights. So please wait and let's work on this political strategy. So Kennedy's got that problem. He's also got the problem of the fact that not only is he a Northern Democrat, he's a Harvard-educated Northern Democrat from a political family. So his Ivy League education, his family background, and everything else makes him seem like Eastern establishment snob, Northern Eastern establishment snob to many Southerners. And so he does not necessarily have much love in the South. So, what happens in the period during the JFK administration and then after he's assassinated? First, his hand is forced by a major development in Birmingham, Alabama. Quite frankly, JFK has to start advocating for civil rights bills, in part because of Martin Luther King and the SCLC's protest in Birmingham, Alabama, which was one of the most segregated cities still left in the country. And in Birmingham, the local sheriff, who's named Bull Connor, actually made his sort of resolve to prevent segregation and the harsh methods he used against peaceful protesters actually gained public support against segregation and against Bull Connor, and actually gave Kennedy some of the public boost he needed, public support he needed to go after and promote some of this. But he's assassinated in late 1963, and his successor, his Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was a formerly very powerful man in Congress in both the House and then later the Senate. LBJ has the gravitas and momentum to press a Civil Rights Act through, and he makes a concerted effort to do it. And so if we were to look at our dramatis personae, as Shakespeare would have said, our major players in the different phases, here we have Bull Connor. As you can see, him standing out, trying to line up and prevent a mass demonstration here against him and against segregation. Bull Connor would be the one who allows fire hoses and dogs to be used against protesters, especially children. So he had no mercy. Martin Luther King being arrested here by the police in peaceful protest. President Kennedy in a pensive moment. And, of course, the guy who would take the baton and keep moving, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Now, I chose this picture because it's an iconic picture of Lyndon Johnson and sort of his technique. To the right here, on the right of this picture, under his nose, is Senator Richard Russell of Georgia. Richard Russell had been Lyndon Johnson's friend for almost 20 years. Johnson first encountered Russell when Johnson first got to the Senate. In spite of this, their personal friendship died during Johnson's presidency. Johnson right here is doing what he often referred to as giving someone the business. I've also seen it called the Lyndon lean-to. So when he would try to politic with individuals who might be opposing him in any issue, he would often lean into them using his height and his sort of his features against someone to invade their physical space, make them uncomfortable, and get them to do something. Sometimes he'd even have his finger right on someone's nose while leaning down and talking to them, making them uncomfortable, trying to get them to accede to whatever demand he was making. Richard Russell being brought in here and Lyndon giving him the business. We'll see Richard Russell is a major player in this part. He's a pro-segregationist, and he's from the state of Georgia. Following up here, we have the House and the Senate. Major players. JFK's youngest brother, Theodore Roosevelt, or Teddy, Theodore Roosevelt. Boy, what a day. This is Teddy Kennedy, JFK's youngest brother. Here, we see another interesting character in our play, and his name is Howard Smith of Virginia. By the way, Teddy Kennedy represents Massachusetts. He's in the Senate. Here we have Howard Smith of Virginia. He's a congressman. He's in the House of Representatives, and we'll see he plays an interesting and important role in the history of the Civil Rights Act. Right here we have Hubert Humphrey, who's Lyndon Baines Johnson's vice president, and will preside over the Senate, as you know, because he's vice president. And so he will be very important in the fight over this bill in the Senate. Also important here, we see Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater is a powerful Republican figure who would eventually run for president, who becomes a presidential candidate. Very conservative. He's from Arizona. Barry Goldwater is an important figure in part of this story. We also have lieutenants on the floor who were like Ted Kennedy. There were two other lieutenants on the floor of the Senate who helped get the bill through. Here is Joseph Clark of Pennsylvania. He's an important figure in this process. And next to him is Clifford Case of New Jersey, who's another important figure in this whole process. He manages to work with the administration. They work together in getting this bill through. We also have the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, Emanuel Seller. Another important person with whom to be reckoned. So he's in a chair of the important committee in the House of Representatives that this would have to go through. So some of the important actors, I wanted you to see them if you are unfamiliar with their pictures. And so we start this bill actually in the House of Representatives. So how does this come about? What happens? What happens, as I said, is that in the House you can see a simple set of political divisions. And they break down sort of like we talked about. You have the Southern Democrats who are pro-segregationists. You have Republicans, a number of Republicans who are not pro-segregationist necessarily, but they are certainly fearful of larger government or big government. So while they will want desegregation and they will want civil rights to be enforced, what they don't want to do is give blank checks or larger powers to the federal government to do that. What we'll also see is some additions and changes to the bill in this process. So the Democrats, most of the Southern Democrats obviously are not supporters of passing the bill. Most Northern Democrats are, and Republicans might be on the fence. While they aren't necessarily against desegregation, they might be against a growing and more powerful federal government to accomplish that. So what we have is a sort of split in the House and in the Senate, and the need to get passage. What are the strategies they employ? The actual people who want an amendment passed or want a bill passed to get this done actually outnumber, most likely, will actually outnumber the people who don't want anything done. So what happens is the Southern Democrats and some of the states' rights Republicans look for some possible way of preventing this bill from going forward, or spiking it, making it so that it loses support, even though they know at the moment they don't have the votes. There are additions made. The first is what's called Title VII. It has an employment clause that prevents discrimination in employment, and it advocates, or basically it creates the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, a federal commission there to implement and to carry out the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and its employment provisions. One of the men opposed to passing this bill, who didn't want to see it succeed, had actually added something. Howard Smith of Virginia added an important word to the text of this bill. So, what is added to the text, and who is Howard Smith of Virginia? So, we start with Kennedy, who had been pushed by the events he saw at Birmingham to take action, saying this was absolutely necessary. The bill that his White House staff had drafted first came to the House. It first went to the Judiciary Committee, who actually had hearings on the bill, and that actually made it a better bill. And the chair of the House Judiciary Committee at the time was, here he is, right here, Seller. So then, as you all know, Emanuel Seller was the chair of the House Judiciary Committee right here. And as you all know, after it goes out of committee, it passed the committee and was ready to go on to the floor. As you know, there's another committee it must go through And that committee is called the House Committee on Rules. Now, the chair of the House Committee on Rules was this man right here. His name is Howard Smith of Virginia. He's a Democrat, he's a Southern Democrat, and he's a complicated man. On the one hand, he is a pro-segregationist who has obstructed all civil rights legislation that has been come his way in the Rules Committee. He was noted for basically weighing down bills or trying to get amendments through or put on them or limiting what could happen to them. So all of these things were techniques he used to bottle up civil rights bills in the House. At the same time, he is also someone who worked closely with Alice Paul, who had been the leader of the National Women's Party, back in the 1920s, and was a lifelong advocate of women's equal rights, and so. What he did was, instead of just having the bill that said there could not discriminate on the basis of color, creed, national origin, he also added the word sex into the text. Now, on the one hand, while this gave him certainly a positive reaction from the women he had worked with and supported women's rights, he most likely added that text not because he was thinking the bill would pass advocating for women's rights. Knowing that he needed to find a way to drive a division between Republicans and Democrats who worked together to support the bill and outnumbered his pro-segregationist group, he felt by adding the word sex in there, it would pluck away a number of supporters. So while the Rules Committee was trying to bog this down and getting this word added and everything else, at the same time, Kennedy was assassinated. And Lyndon Johnson, who's now president, addresses Congress urging them that this needed to be done, especially to honor the dead president, John Kennedy. What you also get is a move to bypass the Rules Committee, which is irregular in the House. As you know, the only way to do it is to get approval, and in order you have to you have to get a special vote to change normal procedure, and that is not a simple majority. So you have to have a vote to suspend the normal rules of the House to bypass the Rules Committee and send it directly to the floor, which is pretty much what happened. They got enough signatures. In the recess during the Kennedy funeral, what a number of people found is that public support was more in favor of desegregationist legislation than was against it. And so, feeling that their stations were more secure in voting for it, a number of people in the House were emboldened and ready to support it. So Smith's strategy didn't fully pan out, but he felt, he got the word sex added to the bill, and so he couldn't bottle it up in the Rules Committee, but the addition of the word sex would probably generate opposition from enough people so that this would be voted down. If we interject for a moment and think about voting order, if we were to sort of label out supporters into three groups or a few groups, we have liberals who are very committed liberals who want to see the amended bill more than the original bill. So the original bill was something that didn't include women, but many liberals wanted women included, and they're happier with the amended bill than the original bill. And so if you had to line up preferences on how they would like their outcomes to be, they would want the amended bill to win first. If they couldn't have this, they would choose the original bill versus no bill. So no bill is their third option, their least favorite option. Moderates would have preferred the original bill, but would prefer the amended bill to no bill. And that's the difference. Is that For this strategy to work, the conservatives and Southern Dems prefer no bill. They prefer the original bill and then the amended bill. And what happens here is that in order for this group to really prevail, okay, their second choice, original bill, would have to be the second choice of the moderates. Well, it's the first choice of the moderates, right? But what they would want is a no bill being their second choice. I'm sorry. No bill would be their second choice. Why? So, if they want no bill, if the conservatives and Southern Democrats want no bill, and they know that it comes down to a voting order, if they can get that amended bill is such a problem, so the choices between the amended bill and no bill, right, in a voting order, they have the most votes because they can align with the moderates and see that that no bill was up higher in their choices. So the liberals would be left out, and the conservatives, Southern Democrats, and some of the moderates would win. That's the strategy Smith is playing for. Let's see how it works. So this is a diagram of a way of looking at a voting procedure. It's called successive procedure, and it's known as what's called a binary procedure, and it's most commonly used in legislatures. So how might the order of these choices be manipulated to achieve the desired outcome of my side, depending on who I am? So here we have O standing for the original bill, A standing for the amended bill, and N standing for no bill. So what we have here is a decision tree. And so what we could see here is the original choice here is we start with the original bill, but that bill is amended by Smith, which leaves the choice here between the amended bill and no bill. And so that becomes the choice. Now, if I'm a Northern Democrat, okay, I prefer the original bill, but I also, if I have a second choice, I choose the amended bill. If I'm a Southern Democrat, I choose no bill first, original bill second, amended bill third. If I'm a conservative Republican, I like the original bill first, the amended bill second, and no bill third. Now, there's a few more amendments that make that amended bill more savory to conservative Republicans and other Republicans in general to prevent them from making their second choice no bill. So if the choice is between an amended bill and no bill, the conservative Republicans will vote for the amended bill as opposed to no bill, which would align them with the Southern Democrats fully. And that would mean that they are now, they have enough votes to defeat. So I know it's complicated, but one of the ways you can look at it is voting orders. If this voting option changed, if you change the amendments, or if there's no chance at an amended bill, does this pass? You can look at people's things, and then you have to assume that people, think, are they voting sincerely or are they voting insincerely? If they're voting sincerely according to their desires or wishes, so for example here, if the amended bill includes the word sex and that's being used as a way of getting people to actually oppose it, so your real desire is to have no bill, you're a Southern Democrat, your desire is for this outcome, N. But you know that some bill is going to pass, so you don't have the choice for this. So what you do instead is you can either try to make the bill as more amenable to you as possible, or if you're just that opposed to it, what you can do is try to get something added to make it so unsavory as that a number of people who might normally support it would vote against it because of the new provision. And so in this case, the amendment, the Smith Amendment, was that attempt. So they were voting insincerely. That's not sincere voting. And so the opposition, the Northern Democrats, the liberals, and some of the moderates understood this and also were able to still had enough of a coalition and chose the amended bill versus the N bill, no bill. Okay, So we have already reminded ourselves about the importance of committee chairs. One of the other things we'll see over this period of time is that we also have the beginning of party realignment, as we talked about in the previous unit on political parties. So what's also happening by the late 60s is, with the influence of bills like this passing, is that you will start to have changing political affiliations. So a number of former Southern Democrats will become Republicans. So they'll align themselves with conservative Republicans. And so now we think of the Solid South as a place that votes Republican, right? That they're red states. But a lot of those states used to be blue states, exclusively blue states, and very blue states. And it's civil rights and some of these issues that actually lead to the transition or change in parties. And that can actually backfire for a number of former Southern Dems who become Republicans because of seniority rules in the House and in party leadership. Is that when they change parties, they also find that committee chairmanships go to other people because they don't have the seniority in the party, or they. So they're sort of starting over again. So they can lose some of their grip and control of these committees. Something to keep in mind. The amendment that Howard Smith introduced passed by a vote of 168 to 133. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed the House by a vote of 290 to 110. So all those attempts at getting rid of it died. But then it had a bigger test, which is the Senate. And in the Senate, you still have Southern opposition, but the Southern opposition might have some more strategies at their fingertips to defeat this bill. You also have some strong supporters, but the key concerns in the Senate is, of course, pro-segregationist opposition. Senator Richard Russell of Georgia is one of them. He threatens to filibuster, and in fact, one of his first acts was in 1935. He filibustered an anti-lynching law proposed by Franklin Roosevelt. So what he was trying to do for the Southern Democrats, or the segregationist Democrats, was to stave this bill off until George Wallace, who's a Alabama segregationist, the governor of Alabama, who's running for the presidency, starts to get more northern segregationist support. Wallace took 30% of the Indiana state Democratic primary in 1964. And so what the Democrats were strategizing is that once they see that someone like George Wallace polls well in the north, a number of northern senators will turn tail or oppose this bill, and it will die in the Senate. So he's trying to buy time. Vice President Hubert Humphrey is putting together a coalition of pro-bill supporters and trying to get them out in force, because he knows that there will be Southern opposition. There will also be conservative opposition, especially with the addition of a few things. Well, first was Title VII. Title VII created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, but it had a number of people concerned that this commission would basically, as a way of preventing discrimination, would enforce companies or schools or these things to basically make quotas, racial quotas for hiring or admissions to schools. And they felt that the EEOC would become a dangerous and powerful bureaucracy that would overstep its authority and just grow the power of the federal government. And so conservatives didn't really like that. It's not that they approved of segregation, they just didn't approve of an overly powerful federal government, and that was more disconcerting to them. Also was the fear of what they called reverse discrimination, and we'll deal with that more specifically in a moment. You, of course, have the government power thing, and Goldwater, Barry Goldwater, is someone who was very concerned about this. Goldwater, of course, running for president in 1964 against Johnson. Goldwater is a lightning rod for conservative opposition. He's a conservative Republican from Arizona. The Daisy ad that we watched with Johnson showing the mushroom cloud after the girls picking the daisy, that was one of his anti-Goldwater ads in 64. So you can see what they thought of Goldwater. You have pro-labor opposition. Now you might wonder why labor union people would worry about an organization there to protect labor. But Lister Hill, who was a New Deal Democrat from the state of Alabama, was a pro-labor advocate, and he felt that what would happen is that this kind of law would undermine the seniority system that was present in many unions and in collective bargaining agreements, and that it might upset the power of labor to help to really take a front row seat in negotiating contracts. At the same time, you have in the state of Illinois, some states had enforced and enacted anti-discrimination legislation. And in Illinois, you had a man by the name of Leon Myatt, who was at the Motorola company. And Motorola had a standard ability test for all employees had to take. Myatt took the standard ability test and didn't score all that well on it, and sued Motorola for violating the Illinois Anti-Discrimination Act. The court actually ruled in favor of Myatt because Myatt's argument was that this test was unfair to culturally deprived and disadvantaged groups, and that this wasn't a necessary exam, that it basically was there just to weed people out, and specifically to weed out minorities and people from disadvantaged groups. What happened here is that seizing on this ruling, there was a fear of quotas. Conservatives seized on this ruling, said, see what's going to happen is you're going to have quotas and you can't test people, and you're going to have less qualified people in jobs. Vice President Humphrey took over on the floor during this process, and first he had assembled an anti-filibuster coalition. First, as he understood that senators could speak twice in a day, and that in order to engage in a filibuster, what they would do is talk until people left the Senate chamber, and then what they would do is see if there's no quota, the Senate must be dismissed. So at any time they could call for make a quorum call in the Senate. So the Senate had to have a majority of you had to have 51 people there, and that way if the Senate doesn't have a quorum, you can't do business, so you adjourn. So actually Humphrey had put together, along with the House Minority Leader, the leader of the Republicans in the House, Everett Dirksen, a coalition so that there would be 35 Democrats and 15 Republicans always on call. So always there, ready, because you'd have the filibuster speaker who's always 51. And so you always have enough. But that way they could make as many quorum calls during the day as they wanted. The problem is they'd run into is that you'd always have enough for a quorum, so they couldn't use that strategy to stop the Senate from doing business. The other thing they did was assembled a coalition of 67 votes, which was necessary to invoke cloture against the filibuster. So they eventually got their 67 votes. So the filibuster didn't work. And the one fear was that, seizing on this ruling, this fear of quotas, Vice President Humphrey assured that there was no quota language in the bill, and that race, religion, national origin, and sex, are listed in the bill, but there's no quotas. It just says that you can't discriminate. He got his lieutenants on the floor moving, so Ted Kennedy, Clifford Case, and Joseph Clark got moving.
Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Everett Dirksen had to get some concessions from the Democratic leadership on this bill in order for him to convince enough Republicans to support it. First, his motivation was that he saw that 60% of the American public in recent polls were in favor of the Civil Rights Act, and he did not want to be on the wrong side of history. So he wanted to be remembered as the guy who helped get the Voting Rights Act passed, or the Civil Rights Act passed, not an obstructionist. He did require certain amendments added in the Senate. First, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, okay, which would be created in order to enforce this. There would be some checks put on it to calm his anti-big government supporters in the Republican Party. So, before we get there, what is this big stink they make about reverse discrimination, and what does it mean? We hear two terms quite a lot, and the questions that I ask, what do they tell us, and do we still use them? Yeah, we still use them. We still use these terms, and I've heard these two come out in classes and people on political talk shows and everything else, and use the terms reverse racism and reverse discrimination. Now take a moment and think about what those mean. Okay, so what is reverse racism? Well, most people would say that in this case it would be black discrimination or African Americans discriminating against white people, or rules being used to elevate one race, or in this case black people, while discriminating against white people. Really, what does it mean? Because the situation I described is one thing, right? That's discrimination based on race. Okay? The belief that one race is inferior to another is racism. To discriminate based on that racism, right? You can discriminate between ice cream flavors. That's not necessarily a bad thing. If you like peach ice cream as opposed to fudge ice cream or cinnamon ice cream, whatever it is, that's up to you. But discrimination based on racism, that's something else. And in this case, you often hear this phrase, reverse discrimination, and sometimes you'll hear reverse racism. So in other words, it almost means that it signals, like when you hear reverse racism, reverse discrimination, you hear this big outcry. So in other words, it also tends to assume that there was one acceptable or previously acceptable form of discrimination. And that's what discrimination really is. And that the real problem here is not the fact that that discrimination is no longer acceptable or allowed. The real problem is we have to add the word reverse, because now we have a a majority that's now being aggrieved at the hands of this minority. And that the real problem is that that there's this discrimination now, that this is reversed somehow. So there was an acceptable form. This is no longer acceptable anymore. So reverse racism, when you think about it, it sort of highlights a majority as an aggrieved party, when in many cases that majority is not an aggrieved party. So it's a way of inventing victimhood for a popular majority of people. That's why this term is used. Because if you just described what went on, racism or discrimination are not okay, right? So an act of believing one race is superior to another and acting on that, discriminating based on that, that's racism, that's discrimination. Why the need for reverse? To highlight the aggrieved nature of what this could be for whites, or to strike fear in their hearts. Believe me, it was deployed with one purpose, and that purpose is to strike fear in the hearts of people, to scare them about this. A number of us have heard these terms used. We may have used them, but we've heard them used and we thought, oh, well, that's the descriptor for it. But when you really think about what's going on, why the need for reverse if we're just describing racism or discrimination? Do we have to highlight that this is somehow worse? And if we do, don't we tacitly accept that there is an acceptable form of discrimination or racism? It's also like the term that I will use right now. Politically correct. We hear that term a lot, right? What does that mean? Well, no, it's not a show that was hosted by a comedian. Well, of course, it is a show hosted by a comedian. But what I'm saying is that I don't know what is politically correct. Saying, well, we used to be able to use certain terms to describe people. So in other words, we were able to formally use terms or ideas or concepts or take certain acts that dehumanized, devalued, or basically insulted other people based on a certain status, age, sex, race, religion, what have you, and found, at least if not open public acceptance of this, we've found certainly people willing to tolerate it. And now the problem is, for politically correct, is that these terms, ideas, feelings, and expressions were never acceptable. But because no one corrected or came out against it, they were allowed. They were excused. They were always inappropriate, but they were at least allowed or seemed to be accepted. But now we have a system that prevents those things, that says, no, this is not acceptable. We're not going to have that. And so what this term effectively does is takes away the scorn from using inappropriate terms, language, concepts, ideas, actions, and places it it's not on the person who uses those outmoded ideas, concepts, actions. It's placed on the person who is the target, saying, well, they need thicker skin. Now I have to be politically correct, so I can't say this anymore. Well, what does that mean? It means I was going to act like a goofball and say something wildly inappropriate, and I used to be able to get away with it. But now I'm the aggrieved party. I'm the victim here. So I can no longer exercise the privilege I had for being part of this majority group and inflicting harm and dehumanizing other people by my words, thoughts, actions, deeds. And the real victim here is me, because I can no longer exercise that power. I want you to think about the layers behind here. And why do I add this interjection? Because we see this deployed politically. Remember? The politics is that fight over who gets what, when, where, how, and what. And how do we motivate people pro, con against a policy? Playing to data doesn't help. We have to play on the heartstrings. So going back to the introductory slides I made here, right? We play on worldview. We play on assumptions. And we scare the heck out of you. Right? What makes negative ads work? Scaring you. Fear. Reverse racism. Reverse discrimination. Scary. You can't do this anymore. You're going to be the one who's left out. And then it also makes certain assumptions, which we'll get to when we talk about the EEOC. But just an interjection, wanted to make that point. We get the amendments added to the bill. One, took some power away from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, saying that it could not bring suits. Okay? So the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission could not bring suits to enforce compliance with the law. Only the Attorney General could do that when a pattern or practice of resistance to the full enjoyment of rights took place. So only the Attorney General could do it. So it took a lot of the teeth out of the enforcement mechanism of this law. So you didn't have, but to Republicans, they say, look, this EEOC could be this nebulous thing that just grows and grows and grows in power and goes far beyond its original programming. Not that a bureaucracy would ever do that. Ever. Right? But they got this in the amendment. The other thing is that there was no requirement of preferential treatment or based on imbalance. So, in other words, you couldn't require a preferential treatment be given. You couldn't base suits on imbalance necessarily. And 3, you had to add the word intentionally. Intentionally discriminate. There is a difference between intentional and unintentional. And so you could have a negative effect, right, through institutional racism, but a lot of times institutional racism is not intentional, and it's hard to prove intentionality. So it just made this a very difficult thing to enforce. But it got something. It got through. The amendments were introduced. The Russell filibuster failed because Mike Mansfield passed a measure of cloture, 71 to 29, overwhelming, got the necessary, more than the necessary 67 votes. The bill passed 73 to 27. The House had to pass the Senate's version of the bill. They had to have a conference committee to work out the details. The House passed the Senate's bill 289 to 126. The House actually picked up or lost some votes, but in the end, Lyndon Baines Johnson signed it the next day, and you have the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed. So we've seen the policy process go through in domestic policy, right? Identifying the problem, formulating a solution, legislating a solution, making the compromise in the legislature, looking at how process and procedure can influence and affect the outcome of a bill, strategizing accordingly. So you don't always get everything you want, but you have to work out how you can do this. Now you have the tough part of implementation. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission would have 5 commissioners with terms for 5 years. Johnson felt he needed a name to chair the committee, and that name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr. Roosevelt Jr. was not Franklin Roosevelt Sr. He was his son, and also not the politician his father was. FDR Jr. was more interested in his yacht and racing his yacht than actually being the head of the EEOC. But he had a name. And so he basically didn't really spend a whole lot of time at EEOC. He tried to get voluntary compliance from companies and schools and businesses and things instead of trying to use the EEOC as sort of a lightning rod to get people to act. He wanted them to volunteer and comply that way. One of his assistants, one of the commissioners, Alfred Blumrosen, was a professor from Rutgers University in New Jersey, and he wanted an expansive role for the EEOC because he saw that too many states had civil rights divisions that were too ineffective. And what he wanted was a creative interpretation of Title VII, so that EEOC would need creative latitude in order to operate. And during FDR Jr.'s chairmanship, he was able to sort of freelance doing that sort of thing. Though FDR Jr. left and was replaced by Stephen Schulman, who also was a short-termer. And Clifford Alexander Jr. was appointed as chair in 1967. At the same time, you have a Congress growing, less enthusiastic about the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and the Civil Rights Act. Congress started cutting the budget to the EEOC, so it was understaffed. Another way, ex post facto way of getting the law changed, even though you can't change the law because you don't have the votes to repeal it, you can affect the budget. So one way of making sure, if you're a Southern Democrat, of preventing this bill from really having force, having teeth, is you take the bureaucracy intended to support it, and you cut its budget, which means that it doesn't have enough staff, it doesn't have the resources it needs to fully enforce the law. So you negatively affect its ability to carry out its mission. And then when you call it to task, you can say, hey, well, you were supposed to enforce this and you didn't do a very good job. And they could make a budget saying, hey, we're all understaffed. We all don't have a budget, but we had much higher expectations for you. So this is a way of setting them up for failure. How understaffed was the EEOC? In the first 100 days, the EEOC got 1,383 complaints. They were budgeted to handle 2,000 complaints in one full year. So in 100 days, 3 months roughly, they got more than half of their yearly budget of complaints. They wound up with 5,000 complaints that year alone. They were budgeted for 2,000. They had to handle 5,000. The problem with intentionality they also had to deal with. So their problems are their budget. Intentionality is another problem. They have to prove an evil motive behind the company or the school and these sorts of things, and it's a very difficult legal standard. So in order for the EEOC, they feel, to really enforce the law, they had to have redefine their scope and appeal to what they called a higher law doctrine. Now, the law banned the intentional discrimination, but what they also argued was that employer practices. So the EEOC said we have to prove that employer practices which prove to have a demonstrable racial effect are included as part of intentional discrimination. Now, Congress by this time had explored the economic plight of minority workers and intended a comprehensive tool to adjust. So the argument the EEOC is going to make is, okay, the law is written that says, we can't enforce quotas and we can't go with unintentional. We only can look at intentionality, and so only the Attorney General can bring suits and everything else. And so basically what we have is now the EEOC saying what we have to do is we actually have to expand our power, but we can't change the actual text of the law. So we have to find ways of making cases that expand our scope to make our job easier with our low staff. So you see how complex this gets? Their budget's cut to try to affect their, decrease their effectiveness. And what they're trying to do is get decisions that not only expand the definition of the law, and in fact, some cases even directly, you could say, violate its text, but also expand their role so that they feel that they can actually enforce it. So that's what the EEOC did. Now, what you could say is that, ask yourself what this process is. Is this just implementation or is this something else? At the same time, we have other things going on. In 1967, in the Watts section in Los Angeles, you have massive race riots. You also have riots in the city of Newark, New Jersey, and in Detroit, Michigan. These riots are in part a result of political dissatisfaction, tired of legal harassment and everything else, but also massive unemployment, poor schooling, poor services, and a number of serious problems. So these are signs, and so a lot of people watch this on the news, and they are quite concerned. Now, institutional racism, what you're going to see is that it has an economic, political effect. And what we see is that as Congress is looking into the problem of institutional racism and people seeing, the riots, which are really a response to institutional racism, within 2 months, the EEOC had started, within 2 months of its start had taken place the 1967 Watts riots. Then you have the Newark riots. Then you have the Detroit riots. And riots challenge the colorblind belief that the Negro problem, so to speak, could be met with a combination of anti-discrimination laws, economic growth, and goodwill. That many African Americans in the United States were losing faith in the democratic process to achieve the goal of equal opportunity. Now, that's a great concern. You also have the Vietnam draft, which we talked about, right? So many African Americans are opposing the draft. By the end of his life in 1968, right before his assassination, Martin Luther King will oppose the Vietnam War, saying that a disproportionate number of African Americans are being called into this conflict, which is unjust. And in 1968, you have an election year in which Lyndon Baines Johnson, his fortunes seriously reversed in his four plus years of presidency, having gone from his great win in 1964 to him declaring that he would not seek the nomination of his party in 1968, engulfed by Vietnam. and the inability to find a resolution or success in the war. Now, they do get some help in all kinds of places. One of the things going back was that during the Kennedy administration, there had been a form of affirmative action which was outlined in this law. And Kennedy, during this time, there was an Affirmative Action Act passed in 1961. It was JFK's Executive Order 10925. It only applied to federal government contractors. It said that there should be no quotas. And it basically said that in all of these contract searches, these contract situations, the search for qualified minority applicants should go out, and then they should be thrown into the pool of applicants. So that the government should make a concerted effort, or that the people that they contract to do government work should make efforts to search for qualified minority applicants. They had kept forms. This was enforced by Form 40, which were racial reporting forms from the organization that was enforcing it. Now, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's understaffing and underfunding led them to using these statistics as a way of pushing towards quotas, even though they weren't supposed to, because that was in the text of the bill. The EEOC got this form data, and it highlighted some of the challenges before it. And there really were challenges. So a number of people who said this wasn't a problem, or, this institutional racism stuff's an excuse. Here's some simple statistics. 11.2% of Kansas City's population was black. 2.1% they were 2.1% of white-collar workers in the city. In Cleveland, 13% of the city's population was black. 3.2% of its white-collar workforce was black. 2.8% worked in the aerospace industry. 1% in air travel in a city like Atlanta. In a blue-collar job like railroads that you could get in, 0.7% of the workforce in Cleveland's railroads were black. 0.7. In white-collar areas, they were low-level white-collar jobs. And in the Office of Federal Contract Compliance, which had been there to enforce the contract compliance and included the provisions of JFK's executive order, it was difficult in construction trades because union memberships often went from father to son, and blacks were a small part of these union memberships. So they had often been shut out of traditional union memberships, and the lack of family connections further prevented them from gaining access to key union memberships. In the city of Philadelphia, in the construction trades, you had fewer than 0.5% of the workforce in construction work as black. So of all the black people who lived in Philadelphia, all the people who worked in construction, 0.5% were black. That meant 99.5% of the construction trades in Philadelphia were white. The Philadelphia Plan came from the Office of Federal Contract Compliance in 1966, still working on just federal contract compliance. And it said that contractors had to present an affirmative action plan before awarding contracts and it applied it to a few cities that had seriously disproportionate black participation in the construction trades. One was San Francisco, one was Philadelphia, and the other was Cleveland. Now, there were complaints by labor leaders which claimed that these were creating basically racial quotas and were sources of reverse discrimination. Business leaders at this time were getting thoroughly confused. They didn't know exactly how to make sure that they had qualified applicants and that they were making strides towards desegregation and everything else. And what this affirmative action thing was that the federal government was now mandating through the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and through the Civil Rights Act of 1965. So a number of business leaders, basically the early versions of their human resources departments, just said, look, government, just tell us what we have to do, and that's what we'll do. But of course, the government can't come out and say, you have to have this, you have to have that, because that would have the effect of basically making a quota. So you have two groups in the implementation phase looking for greater clarity, and one group trying to sort of gain more authority in this. They also get help not only from the Philadelphia Plan, which they start to use to help give some clarity, but in 1968, Richard Nixon wins an unlikely presidential victory. Unions started to support Nixon. Not too many just yet, but they would. In 1968, when Richard Nixon won, he's a Republican. He's a little more conservative. And in 1969, he chose Arthur Fletcher, who was a black man, as Assistant Secretary of Labor. And he enforced employment standards. It's he who adopted the Philadelphia Plan for the government and won over Nixon on this plan. So Nixon sees that this plan, the Philadelphia Plan, of having contractors having to present affirmative action plans before awarding the federal contracts, he likes this plan. He wants to see it, a larger implementation of it. And Nixon at the same time is looking to drive a wedge, a political wedge, between Democrats and their bases of support. And one of those bases he felt could be plucked away were a particular group of people. He felt that labor itself, organized labor union people, could be broken away. He was looking for a policy that was anti-labor and pro-black, and that it could be pinned on this very Democratic-supported Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, all these things, and he could come in and look as the guy who's saying, hey, look, I'm the real solution here. So that way the Democrats in Congress would lose their support, a lot of them would lose their support, and you'd have white, blue-collar workers run over and become Republicans. And he'd break the back of the old alliance in the Democratic Party. In Philadelphia, to give you some more statistics, pipe fitters, 12 of 2,335 pipe fitters in the city of Philadelphia were black. What they had to do now is that they had to, according to the Philadelphia Plan, in order to get this contract, they had to give hiring goals, saying that they were going to increase 5 to 8% in 1970, and then by 1973, 22 to 26% of their pipe fitter workforce would be black. That sounds like a quota? The irony of all of this is that you have Republicans defending quotas and adopting an expansive language of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission against a literal interpretation of the law, which would be proposed by more Democrats, as a way of basically smearing this over Democrats, saying, look at what they gave you. Here, I'm here to step in. Don't you want to support the Republicans now? And it started to turn, because by 1970, what Nixon sees in the midterms is something called the Hard Hat Rebellion. So the Hard Hat Rebellion in 1970 was a group of blue-collar white workers and organized labor that actually had marched in favor of Nixon. They'd come out and voted in favor of Republicans in the midterms. Some of them switched their party affiliations, and they had supported the Vietnam War. They supported Nixon on the Vietnam War. Now, maybe they didn't necessarily agree with the war, but they certainly didn't protest. Nixon would often refer to this group of people as his silent majority. He said that really there's a silent majority of Americans who aren't out protesting the war and bad-mouthing the country. And then maybe they don't agree with everything about the war. And it's these hardworking people whose sons also go to war. They also get drafted. And they see these college kids get deferments and everything else. And these smart college people who all go out and talk like this. And Nixon also had some sympathy from that group. Nixon grew up poor. He was a working class kid who later earned scholarships and stuff to college and law school. So Nixon could play on that, and that's exactly what he's doing. So what we see is that another turn in the history of this policy has nothing to do with the actual intent to enforce a good civil rights policy. It has a lot more to do with breaking the back of Democratic opposition. So what we see is a tangled mess so far, right? So Nixon would start to change his strategy after the Hard Hat Rebellion and start dialing back on his support for the Civil Rights Act and the EEOC. At the same time, the EEOC is moving straight ahead with its own agenda because they're a bureaucracy. They have their own agenda, and it's not Nixon's. One is going to the courts. One of the more famous cases involved Duke Power Plant. Willie Griggs was identified as the plaintiff. He was the youngest, and he would have an easier time getting a job if it didn't work out for him and he was fired. But what this was an attempt to do is get the Supreme Court to rule on an EEOC decision on effect over intent. And that way, if the EEOC made a finding, Willie Griggs' simple complaint was black people at Duke Power Plant were being paid $1.65 an hour versus $1.81 an hour, which was paid to white people for the same work. So what Willie Griggs was also talking about too was saying that certain jobs were not really open to black people, and because of tests and other requirements that were not even necessary for the job. So the test, it wasn't like a test saying you had to know this, you had to know that for your job. The job could be a janitor. That was not necessary. The test itself was irrelevant. And it was just used as a way of filtering out applicants who could do the job, were fully qualified to do it, but also preventing certain higher pay positions from minorities and underprivileged people. The Supreme Court, in this case, could rule on an EEOC decision. The EEOC favored Griggs in this case. And the EEOC decision cited effect over intent, saying that, in other words, the effect of these tests had an effect of discriminating against blacks. It didn't show that Duke intentionally discriminated against black workers. There was a series of amicus, or friend of the court briefs, filed by the Chamber of Commerce in favor of Duke Power. In 1971, in a unanimous decision, the Supreme Court sided with Willie Griggs, saying that good intent or absence of discriminatory intent does not redeem employment procedures or testing mechanisms that operate as basically that operate as as bait in headwinds for minority groups and are unrelated to measuring job ability. In other words, very simply put, the Supreme Court basically just looked at the EEOC's decision and the text of the Civil Rights Act and basically just said that that the EEOC could look at effect, not just intent. So it basically expanded the scope of the Civil Rights Act and went against the direct text of the bill or the law. The Civil Rights Act was passed to achieve equality and aimed at the consequences of employment practices and not simply motivation. So in other words, In this case, the way the court read the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it said the intention of the law was to end these kinds of practices, discrimination, and protect the civil rights of individuals. And it said that, yes, okay, intentionality was added, but its intended effect, was in fact aimed at achieving equality and the consequences of employment practices, not simply motivation. So, the key here was that the court would say if this was a business necessity, so in other words, if a test was a business necessity. So, for example, I'm applying to be an accountant, okay, a certified public accountant, and I make a claim saying, well, they required me to pass the CPA test. The court would not have any sympathy with my case, making an argument saying, well, the CPA test was used to discriminate against me. It's like, well, it's a business necessity. You either are a CPA and have passed the test, or you're not, and that's a requirement you have for the job. However, in Griggs' case, he's saying, look, I applied to be the maintenance man and clean rooms and things. Okay, the test I was being asked was about, coal power generation and things. It had nothing to do with cleaning rooms. This was simply added as a way of preventing certain applicants from getting the job. It had nothing to do with the requirements or the skills for the job at hand. The Griggs decision is like Brown, but it worked faster. By 1977, Congress required that government contractors set aside 10% of funds for minority contractors. And you start to see affirmative action take hold, but still it's early. It's still early, and there's questions about affirmative action. Like, what does it mean? Are these quotas? Because you start to see 10% being reserved and everything else. In 1973, Alan Backey is a white honor student. He is a former Marine who served in Vietnam, who applies to medical school at the University of California at Davis. Alan Backey said that there was 100 slots open and 16 spots were held for minorities. Backey was not chosen for admission at UC Davis that semester to the medical school. And he argued that they are not choosing between qualified and unqualified, but exercising discretion among groups of qualified students who differed by degree. This is the claim made by the UC Davis, saying what they did was they had a quota. Well, not really a quota system so much, but they said they had a. Well, I guess you could say a quota because they had 16 spots for minorities out of 100. Now, what they argued was that they were not picking between unqualified and qualified. What they're doing is exercising discretion among groups of qualified students who differed by degree. So they were everyone they selected, they said, were qualified. What Backey argued was that you were taking people less qualified than him. So people with lower scores and achievements than him were admitted to the medical school while he was not. And the Supreme Court was very interested in Mr. Backey's case. 4 justices in the Supreme Court say that the University of California at Davis violated the colorblind principles of the Civil Rights Act. 4 justices said that benign discrimination was acceptable if intended to give minority applicants equal opportunity. The deciding vote was Justice Lewis Powell, Jr., who argued that the University of California at Davis violated the law. The Backey decision. Backey was discriminated against because of his race, according to Powell. However, the university could use race as a plus factor to foster diversity. So let's get this decision straight. 4 justices said that the law was clear. It clearly violated. The law is colorblind. You can't discriminate. And in this case, the way that UC Davis had its policy, it discriminated against Mr. Backey, who was fully qualified to be admitted. 4 justices said, well, benign discrimination is okay. because you're all allowing, qualified applicants, and you're giving minority applicants a chance at equal opportunity. Bakke deciding vote here is Lewis Powell, Justice Lewis Powell, who said they violated the law because Bakke was discriminated because of his race. In other words, it was not his qualifications that prevented him from his admission to UC Davis. It was the simple fact that he was not a member of a protected minority class that qualified for one of those 16 reserved spots. In other words, the quotas kept him from being admitted. And the problem with this decision is that if you stop there, I think this would have been a very clear decision. Okay? But what happened is he didn't. He went forward and he said, however, universities could use race as a plus factor to foster diversity. Well, wasn't that what UC Davis was doing? Weren't they using this as a plus factor? Saying, okay, we're going to have 16 spots. So is this a plus factor? You could say no. But it does still leave an ambiguous decision in Bakke. Even if you say, okay, no quotas, no more 16 spots, but let's say I have a pool of 50 applicants, or let's not say 50, say 200 applicants, and I can only choose 100. And it turns out that, I have 150 people who are all qualified. They've all passed what I believe should be minimum standards for admission. And I go along and say, okay, these are all the top scoring, but I also give a little plus factor to say, okay, these students aren't at the tops, but, I don't have any other black applicants, and this is someone who's qualified, and, we need to include people, minorities, because historically we have not included them. And, if I shut out the only black applicant, am I denying a qualified spot? Is race in this case a plus factor? Is this person not qualified? Well, no, this person is qualified. It's just that race became a plus factor here. And that makes a lot of people angry. But at the same time, you also have to consider the fact that without some of these protections, a number of schools would have immediately discounted it, that application. So it becomes an interesting problem for the courts to figure out. So you had a law that was written one way, right? And we're fighting the courts are interpreting it in its own way. The Bakke decision also leaves this ambiguous nature. And once again, the concept of reverse discrimination gets thrown around, and people start wondering about this affirmative action. I asked you a question earlier what the EEOC's role was and what this meant. Were these more rounds of legislation? The answer, yes. So in other words, the legislative process got returned to during the implementation process. So as the EEOC was implementing this policy and during this implementation, what's also happening as the EEOC is adopting a strategy to enforce the Civil Rights Act and looking for a broader means of interpretation and making new law and precedent at the same time, and it's going to use the courts to do that. The courts are asked to interpret the law. The broad interpretations it took at times and the vague interpretations it took at times effectively made new law. So what we have is even during the implementation phase, new law is being made. So the policy process isn't always so clean in each step. What happens? Well, you also have another case right after Bakke called Kaiser Aluminum. At the Gramercy Los Angeles plant of Kaiser Aluminum, fewer than 2% of craft workers were black, while local labor force was 39% black. Kaiser adopted a program of having one non-minority for one minority until the numbers equaled the percentage of blacks in the labor force. Brian F. Weber, who was called the blue-collar Bakke, brought suit against Kaiser Aluminum. And in District and Circuit Court of Appeals, they found in favor of Weber, just as Bakke had been found in favor of earlier. In 1979, the Supreme Court ruled against Weber. The Civil Rights Act, the Supreme Court said, didn't prohibit voluntary affirmative action programs, and there was a 5-2 majority in the case. Chief Justice Warren Burger and Justice William Rehnquist offered the dissent and had referred to the legislative history of the act. So they had looked at the legislative history, and Rehnquist would be the person who one of the people in the Supreme Court through the Reagan years who looks very much towards the legislative history. So what happens? We saw that there were more rounds of legislation. Politically outside forces also once again influence this act. One is that by 1979 and 1980, the presidential election in 1980, is that through the 70s, especially after the Nixon era, you start to see a resurgence in American conservatism, and slowly it makes ground. And in 1980, American conservatives are successful in their support of Ronald Reagan as a candidate for the presidency in the United States. Reagan is a conservative. His vice president, George Bush, is a moderate. They're a Republican. And what they do is they rise. Nixon was very successful in splitting off blue collar and many labor union members from their Democratic support and have them start voting Republican. Reagan picked up on some of that. And what Reagan did was argued for a return to traditional values. In part of that process, he was appointing judicial conservatives and who advocated for judicial restraint and legal textualism. Two things that we've talked about when we talked about the courts, such as Antonin Scalia, who's appointed by the Reagan administration. Sandra Day O'Connor is appointed. William Rehnquist, who's already on the court, gets elevated to Chief Justice of the Supreme Court when Warren Burger leaves. You have Justice Powell added. You have Justice Kennedy added. And then during the Bush administration, Thurgood Marshall, who was on the court, retired, and he is replaced with Reagan's chair of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, Clarence Thomas. Clarence Thomas, while chair of the EEOC, took a much more conservative and less invasive approach for the EEOC. So this bureaucracy that had seen sort of a growth in its power and its advocacy has a new chair that wants to squash it. So then he became a Supreme Court justice. So you have a different kind of interpretation of the law in the Reagan administration and the Bush administrations. And what we see is that during this period of time, affirmative action is actually whittled away. In 1989, in the Wards Cove Packing Company versus Antonio case, the court scaled back the Griggs decision and shifted the burden of proof. Now, during this early period of time, the burden of proof in these discrimination suits, in these EEOC suits, the burden of proof was placed on the defendant to prove why you were not a discriminatory party, whatever. Now the court scaled that back and actually shifted the burden of proof onto on whether something was a business necessity from the employers to the employees. So the Griggs decision had said that, the burden of proof in those cases, saying that this test is needed is a business necessity. The burden of proof there is on the employer, saying, okay, you've adopted the test. Be able to explain why that test is required. Okay. What happens in 1989 is the Supreme Court reverses that part of it doesn't reverse it, but changes that part of the decision and says from now on that it's actually employees who should have to make that case. Racial discrimination against white or black is generally unconstitutional except when the government acts to remedy a clear pattern of past discrimination. And any race-based affirmative action must be narrowly tailored to further compelling government interest. Clarence Thomas becomes the deciding vote in a 5-4 decision, arguing that racial paternalism and its unintended consequences can be as poisonous and pernicious as any other form of discrimination. In other words, Clarence Thomas starts arguing that in some ways this affirmative action law is actually racially poisonous and pernicious, and it's in and of itself a form of discrimination. You also have public changes. You have like I said, the defection of white blue-collar workers from the Democratic Party, and major issues that get them to become Republican are the issue of taxes, welfare spending, and the role of government. Many start to be concerned about the high rate of taxes being charged and the government's desire to gain tax revenue. Welfare spending increases, and the role of an expansive government and bureaucracy. In 1991, a poll was taken where 2/3 of whites opposed affirmative action, while 60% of blacks called for more rigorous enforcement of it. In fact, what we also see is that by the early 1990s, white and black were worlds apart in perception of race relations. The Democrats had to choose, and some chose working class whites. Republicans began appealing to racial anxieties of whites, and by 1970 you have rising unemployment. The 1970s saw rising unemployment and a decline in high-wage manufacturing jobs, and so basically you create a zero-sum game pitting two groups of people with similar economic interests actually against each other for political gain by parties. These wedge issues basically were able to splinter people off, and direct appeals to prejudice may no longer be acceptable, but race, in an indirect and sometimes subliminal way, remains a strong undercurrent in politics between Republicans and Democrats. I think, as we saw in the 1988 election materials that you looked at. You also have, by 1994, a Contract with America, which further shows more support for Republican Party being ascended and further scaling back more on affirmative action. And by 1996, you have California Proposition 209, where it passes by a margin of 54% to 46% against, and it banned the use of race and sex in college admissions, and contracting and public employment. And you also see similar bills now enacted in Michigan, Florida, and New Hampshire. The Supreme Court recently upheld those laws, these state laws preventing affirmative action in these areas. Recent studies that looked at the 1996 California Proposition 209 showed that men supported it overwhelmingly, 61 to 39%. Women were against it, 52 to 48%, and blacks and Latinos were against it. As we evaluate this program, we have to understand that have affirmative action is now 50 years old. And the question remains, has it worked? On the one hand, we could say that has the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the affirmative action in the EEOC provision in Title VII actually achieved greater black participation in education and the workforce? Answer, yes. Compared to where we were at 50 years ago. In part because of those practices, more African Americans have had the chance to go to college that they were shut out from earlier, have had more chance to work, especially in white-collar fields, than ever before, and also their pay gap, the fact that they are paid the same for the same work as whites, has also shrunk, but not entirely. Same with women. More women are employed in these areas. Women have really benefited from some of these cases. However, is there still room to go? Women are still paid less than their male counterparts for the same work. So it's not been perfect, but it actually has. What are the unintended consequences? Well, the unintended consequences are probably that, this was a law passed to make things fairer. It wasn't passed to
to have quotas, which was directly against the text, which it allowed for the creation of in some cases, so the interpretation of the law changed. So you have a number of unintended consequences. The question is, have the unintended consequences, another unintended consequence that some people have talked about, is that you have women or minority applicants who get jobs, and a number of people assume that they are people who got their jobs because of affirmative action policy, not because they were qualified. Because the other unintended consequence is that this affirmative action process was never intended to taint or to stain a minority applicant as someone who's always less qualified. But the discussion has become that it's always between a well-qualified white person who's a male and a lesser qualified minority applicant. That seems to be the constant division. So that wasn't the intent of the law, but it certainly has become part of our discussion, a part of the lexicon, and the way people discuss it. So what we see is a very complex tradition. Whether you agree with affirmative action or not, what we see is that this was a bill. We get to see how it was written, its legislative history, what it was intended to do, how it grew in scope, and what we also see is how this policy process really works and how long you can think of it as. Implementation keeps going on, legislation keeps going on, evaluation keeps going on, and how these pressures influenced it. So what we have is a large case study in a particular piece of domestic policy and its larger effects.